Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Tugboat Talks. On today's episode, we got a real great treat for you. We got the return of the doc. Dr. Bradley Truman Noel is back again on the Tugboat Talks podcast, and this time we're here to take on the topic of creation as well as intelligent design, evolution, dinosaurs. If you haven't had a chance to check out the original conversation that I had with the doc, you can check it out here. And then I'm also going to link the doc's YouTube page so that you can have a look at that, and we'll try to do that over here. Check out his stuff. He's got a lot of great resource material and a lot of phenomenal teaching up on his YouTube page. So please check that out. As always, if you haven't already, please link the thing and subscribe, and make sure you continue to follow along with what we're trying to do here. Just having great open conversations and sharing them with the world. So once again, as always, if you like this, please like, share it, show it to your friends, spread it around the internet. Let's get it around to people who would find it interesting, and thank you for the support. God bless. Here's the conversation with Dr. Bradley Truman Noel. Welcome to another edition of the Tugboat Talks podcast. Happy to have once again, throwing up the deuces, Dr. Bradley Truman Noel. Big hit from the first episode.
Oh, no doubt.
Yes, no doubt. Is right
here.
Listen, I got to say, number one, thanks for coming on the last time. Obviously, it was I really enjoyed the conversation. And it seems that several hundred other people also enjoyed it quite a bit. So we're going to go for round two here now.
Well, given all the preaching I've done, several hundred would be a record.
Listen, I've seen you speak to rooms of several hundred many times.
Yeah, I'm talking about people who enjoyed it.
No, yeah, this is true. This is true. Yeah, you had one in the back, but that was only when I could muster enough attention to actually pay attention for 30 minutes or so.
I did notice. I did. I don't want to lie.
I know. I was a holy terror. I was trying to explain to somebody the other day about like how the person that they've met now is not the person that I was.
No, not the same at all. Not the same at all.
All right. So listen, today I was having a conversation with a few friends who had watched the last podcast, and a big piece of the pie that we want to bite off is around this pandemic. Like if God, I'm going to dive right in because I'm fired up about this already. If God is omnipotent and all powerful and transcends time and space, why does he allow things like this global pandemic to strike? Like, it's the biggest piece of my faith that I have difficulty resolving is people born in third world countries, right? Things like this pandemic, even throwback to Noah and the ark, and why would God, and I don't want to give you too much to unpack, or even most recently, this travesty in Nova Scotia. Like, why would an all-powerful God, if he really does love us so, why do these things still happen?
That's the biggest and oldest philosophical conundrum in terms of Christianity. I believe it was Epicurus, actually. His original statement, and I'm not going to get it exactly right now, but it was the idea that if God is all powerful, why doesn't he stop it? If he's all good, he must want to stop it. So the fact that evil exists means he's neither all powerful nor all good. Right. Because an all-powerful and all-good God would not permit the evil. But there's been traditionally three responses to this. The one on the one side, and you'll see some of the right-wing figures in the U.S. allude to this. They'll say, God has sent another punishment. God has sent this virus, or God has sent this hurricane to punish, the homosexual community down in New Orleans, or whatever their target is at the time.
Right.
That's one I kind of dismiss right out of hand, that God is going for one thing with this virus, God is punishing indiscriminately. You've got Christians dying, non-Christians dying. So if God is sending this as a punishment, he's pretty well just laying it out over everybody.
Well, in that case, then you've got, like, is it a loving God or is it a malicious God?
Exactly.
right? Which is the real question. And I think that that's a big one that even, people who are stout atheists or whatever, that's a big part of the, basically they got to that fork in the road and couldn't resolve it.
I'm convinced that what we call it the problem of evil is one of the biggest stumbling blocks, one of the biggest challenges the church faces right now in terms of reaching the undecided or even reaching the atheist or agnostic. They can't get their head around this. They can't get their head around why God allows these types of things to happen to children, why God just sits idly by, as it were, and watches so much evil prevail. It's a massive issue. You see it all the time.
So how do we make sense of this? How do we make sense of, and number one, this comes from a basis that I understand that, like, as much as we should try, it's a futile effort for a finite human being who lives a maximum of 100 years to grasp an eternal being that we believe in. Now, and
Right.
then for anybody who doesn't believe in that eternal being would take that as a cop out, as an easy get out of jail free, because you're like, oh well, we don't have the capability to understand God, right? And so that's where my head is at, is like, how does he allow these things happen, or this is a part of a conversation actually that I had with the guys last night, is does he allow these things to happen, or do they happen and then he sort of turns them, as we with the Romans 8:28, for God works together for those, right, for the good of those who love the Lord. But so how do we make sense of that?
Okay, so this answer was in three parts, and that was the first part I gave, which is the God who actively sends these things. I kind of dismissed that out of hand.
Right. Okay.
Romans 8:28 speaks to what would be I would consider the traditional Christian view of this, which is that God allows these things to happen because God gave us, oh, that's cool. You got the scripture there.
Yeah, I'm getting
God
better
gave
at
us, God gave us free will right off the bat. And it wasn't an insult to his sovereignty. He sovereignly gave us free will and allowed us to choose. And so as we choose and as we make poor decisions, things arise in the world. Climate change is impacting some of the weather we see. People abuse other people. Here's like a stat that I heard one time, which I can't verify right now, but Americans spend enough on pet food to solve world hunger.
Right.
So then we sit back and go, oh, God, how come you're allowing people to starve to death? And I think God's looking down at us and saying, I was going to ask you fellas the same question.
Right.
So because of free will, which he sovereignly gave us, he is now allowing the consequences of human decisions and human sin to play out in the world. But this middle approach says that God does work out everything for the good of those who believe him and trust in him. In other words, they weren't good to begin with, or there'd be no working out to do. So clearly there's working to be done. And it's because these things are not good. So what God is God is not standing pushing evil back all the time. Rather, God is redeeming out of the consequences of our poor choices. Always, always, always redeeming, always bringing good out of what's not good. That's the standard response to this.
So was that part two, or
That's part two.
That's part two. I don't want to
So
cut you off again, so I want to give you.
No, so when it comes to this, no, we can talk about each part because I'll remember them. So when it comes to this tragedy in Nova Scotia, there's an individual clearly bent on evil, and God does allow that to take place. And to be honest with you, I wish he wouldn't. I wish he would jump in and stop this stuff. And we can talk more about that in a minute if you'll come back around to it. But he didn't, and so this evil takes place. So what God will do then is work in 1,000 and 1,000 more different ways to redeem, to make good out of what is clearly the worst kind of tragedy we can imagine. That was perpetrated not by God, but by human free choice.
Once again through free will. And we'll circle back again to free will. I'll make a note of that because the free will conversation is a big piece of this that I want to revisit again.
Yeah, we need to ask the question, and I'll throw out the bait here now. What would it look like if God did intervene?
Right. Okay.
Okay, so let's leave that's the second point. The third option is written by a guy I've met a couple of times. His name is Thomas Jay Oord, Oord, and he wrote a book called God Can't, which is the lay version of it for your readers. And he basically argues that God can't intervene because God's essential nature is love. And so the more academic book that God Can't is based on is called The Uncontrolling Love of God. And he argues that love in its very nature can never, ever control. So God could not jump in and stop this if he wanted, because love cannot ever control, not real love.
Wow. Like, and it's crazy because if you spewed that, if you're at a party and you're having a couple of drinks and somebody says, well, why does God allow all this shit to happen in the world? Right. And you throw it at him. God is in his essence love, and because of that, love has no ability to control or manipulate. Somebody's like, "Oh, well, that's a cop-out answer." But the truth of the matter is, if you look at it from an academic standpoint, that's an incredible theory.
I'm really interested in it. I've read both those books. The Uncontrolling Love of God is the more academic one, and then one just called God Can't. And it's really worth grappling with. And he walks it through a number of different ways, and I can't unpack it all here now. But even down to miracles, how God does, because he still believes in miracles, but God can't control. So how does God bring about a miracle in your life if he can't actually control you? And so what he does is he partners.
Yep.
God is always partnering, both with creation and with willing free agents. And so that's kind of if you've got the God who's not malicious, but if you've got the God who's actively sending this stuff over here, and then you've got the God who doesn't send it, but is always redeeming in the center, then Tom is proposing on this side that God couldn't actually stop it if he wants, because love does not ever control.
So let's take that all the way back to the Crusades.
Yep.
So when it came to the Crusades and they're claiming God, right? And then you turn around and so all of that travesty, in your opinion, would be perpetrated by free will under a false moniker.
Oh, absolutely.
And you think that God is up there watching that happen, and his heart is just breaking because he sees what his children are doing to each other.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, the commandment that says you shouldn't take the name of the Lord your God in vain, that's not swearing, eh? That has nothing to do with, God's last name being damn it. You take the name of the Lord your God, and the name in Hebrew scriptures is synonymous with revealed character. So when I hear the name John Hilliard, that's everything about John that's ever been revealed to me. That's the totality of who you are. So when you do a crusade in the name of God, you have taken the name of God in vain, because you're acting on his behalf when he's not commissioned you. That's what the commandment's actually about. Doing things on God's behalf that God has not ordained. That's blasphemy.
Because it says don't take the Lord's name in vain. It doesn't say don't speak the Lord's name in vain.
Right. It's not swearing. It's invoking his name for maleficent purposes.
Wow, which is hilarious because you've known me to be a bit of a potty mouth in the past.
I appreciate you cleaning up your language for this very podcast.
I do, and I do, and for my mom, because she also watches these as well.
That's good. Good for Diane.
Yeah, that's right. It's interesting that because I always used to, not a joke. It's a serious rule in my house. I've told, and I won't give you the list of words that they can say, but there's a long list of words that people. I have no problem with people saying in my house. But I have kicked people out for using the GD or the JC. I'm like, no, I don't play that. You get out of my house. And I've done that to really good friends of mine who you might know, and said, you speak it again, you're gone. Right.
And it's not that we can do that. I'm just saying that commandment is not speaking to that in particular.
No, but that's a very interesting, because once again, this is one of these things that is very, very commonly misunderstood.
Yeah. Swearing is just disrespectful.
which
right? I mean, no, to take the Lord's name in vain, which is why you're kicking people out, is just blatant disrespect.
100%.
And so what I'm saying is, you don't need that particular commandment to not swear in terms of the Lord's name.
So the way that I've kind of reconciled this whole journey for myself personally is, and the problem with it is, it's not the happy, easy-go-lucky answer. But the reality is, and I'll give you two analogies. Number one, there is no light without dark. Right? There is no, and for anybody, any universal or whatever, there's no yin without a yang, just for anybody to make somebody else mad. But there's no light without dark, right? If there is only light, you are just as blind as you are if you are in the dark. Only dark.
Yeah, if there's no dark and light, you don't know one from the other.
Right? And
you have to have dark to know what light is.
Yeah, so you've got to have down times to appreciate good times. Right? And then the other side of that is, you ask anybody in a kitchen, the number one thing that any good chef reaches for almost always is salt.
Right.
Now, you don't pick up a handful of salt and lick, like, it's not the most delicious ingredient.
Right.
But it's meant to be introduced into that recipe to bring about some contrast, so the positive flavors can flourish.
Exactly.
That's the only way that I've, that's in my humble sort of fumbling around in the woods trying to make sense of my own.
Let's go back to what happens if God starts stepping in.
Yeah.
So, see, people want this. So what they want is, when you've got the terrible crime, they want God to step in and stop that crime. So we'll think there of abuse or murder, these types of things, where they want God to actually step in and stop the individual from doing something. But if you play that out, so if you're not free, so if God steps in when you come home and you're going to raise your hand against your wife, does he also step in when you kick the cat on the way in the door? Does he step in when you break the speed limit or go through the stop sign? Does he step in when you buy 2 bags of chips because he knows you don't need no more chips and it's not good for the body?
Yeah, 100%.
So if you start, and then people want God to do this on a scale of 7.5 billion people. So is he only stepping in on the very heinous crimes? Is he stepping in on the next level of crimes? And if he's all the time managing people so they can't hurt one another, in what sense does anyone have free will?
Well, and that's the crazy part, because in my opinion, if God is love, his number one thing that he wants with us is a relationship. He wants us to seek after him as his children. That's my perspective. And
right, yeah.
And in that, if God intervenes, I mean, there'll still be people, there's people right now saying that COVID-19 is not a real thing. Listen, and they're all survival of the fittest. Well, guess what? The fittest are staying home in their living room, boys. You know what I mean? It might not be this fit. It might be this fit. But anyway, we'll leave that where it is. But if God reveals himself in such a blatant manner, there is no more denying that there is a God. There is no more struggling and trying to find God in the beauty of nature or in your walk in your life. And in doing so, God is also forcing himself on you in a belief standpoint. Right? Yeah. So then what you've got is you've got a scenario where, instead of a loving pursuit of a child and a father, you now have a Stockholm syndrome situation where you never had a choice in the first place to believe or not. And if that's the situation, then now the value of that relationship has gone out the window, because it's not a two-way relationship anymore. It's a one-way relationship.
So if you take the basic premise that God's essential nature is love, and everything he does is out of love, then suddenly some of this really start to fall into place. And I think one of the challenges in the church is we've said, oh yes, but God is also justice, and God is also this, and God is also that. Those are certainly characteristics that God has. God is a just God. God is a righteous God. But the only thing the scripture says God actually is that God is love. His eternal essence is love.
And
it's
all love.
Yes, it's an unconditional love, really. And I think part of the reason we have trouble with this is because we can't wrap our heads around that kind of self-effacing, a self-sacrificial love. It's a totally pure love that gives, only ever gives. And it's a little hard for us to wrap our heads around that, because all we have on this earth is kind of a warped form of that.
So then if you take that, does that translate then to the Old Testament with regards to the God who would smite people out of anger?
So that's a whole different podcast,
right?
The understanding. But I will say this. I think we've read the Bible backwards in many ways, and this has been brought to my attention in recent years by guys like Brian Zahnd and Bruxy Cavey and others. Most Christians, and our tribe in particular, start in Genesis like you would, and you read through and you get a very angry God, and he smites people and he's very harsh. And that goes right through to Malachi. And then you get these 4 books, the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And Jesus appears on the scene, and he's kind of an interesting dude. He wears a white dress. He floats 6 inches above the ground. He's all nice. He's loving everybody, and he's turning cheeks and all this business. And we're like, ooh, that dude is weird. And then you hit Acts, and then Paul's letters, Romans, Corinthians, and they start to seem to drift back towards the God that we thought we knew in the Old Testament.
Right, okay.
Paul talks about, don't do this, don't do that, hellfire, brimstone, and then Revelation. Whereas Jesus said, I have come to show you the Father. Paul said Jesus is the image of the invisible God. So what we really need to be doing with Scripture is to start with the Gospels and say, who is God? Oh, he's that guy in Jesus. What you see in Jesus, that's who God is. Now, if you can't figure out what Paul is talking about in Romans 9 to 11, when he's talking about all the predestination stuff and the harsh stuff, well, you have to line that up to Jesus in the Gospels. If you can't figure out the God who appears to order genocide in the Old Testament, you don't start there. You start with Jesus, and you try to line up the Old Testament with what you see in Jesus. If you can't, you stick with Jesus. So that means instead of understanding, Leviticus or Judges and understanding Romans and the Gospels being the odd man out, we start with the Gospels. If we can't line this stuff up, we keep working at it, but we stick what we know with Jesus. We stick with Jesus.
Well, and it's interesting because we are Christians. We're not Godians, right?
Precisely. So we should really do another one on the use of the Old Testament by Christians, because I'm convinced that it's our inability to really read and understand and apply the Old Testament is just killing us today in a dozen different ways.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of that comes out of, and forgive me for using a term that most people get offended by, but I'm using it in the proper way. It comes out of ignorance. It comes out of a lack of formal education with regards to theological matters and understanding, like, how many times have people whipped it in my face about tattoos and Leviticus and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, man, all you got to do is read the rest of that passage to realize that you can't wear mixed fabrics. You got to stand up every time somebody who's older walks in the room. There's no.
You can't have potatoes and turnips in the same garden. And the crowd, that's true. And the crowd yelling at you about tattoos are wearing their polyester cotton blends with the potatoes and turnips back home in their garden.
100%.
It's all in the same chapter, never mind different books. It's just in the same chapter. Within 6 verses, you find that. And we've been doing that for years. So we should circle back around to that one.
Yeah, okay, we'll do that. I touched as much as there's one other thing in that Romans 8:28 that I want to, and you know what? Just for shits and giggles here, we're going to share the screen again just because I can. And I want to read it in context. So it's here for anybody who looks at it. I'm reading NIV, so don't hate on me, but it is what it is. That's the most widely accepted from what I can do.
Yeah.
What would you say is the most widely accepted translation of the Bible? outside of
NIV.
King James Version, because we all know everybody loves that.
NIV has been. The ESV is making strides lately, but the NIV is still the standard.
Okay, so we'll stick with NIV in this capacity. And we know that in all things, and I heard Erica speak on this one time about how that little word makes such a difference, because some translations of the Bible say all things work together for the good of those who love the Lord.
Yes.
Well, in that capacity, you're saying that you have to live a charmed life. But if you put that little tiny word in, we know that in all things, so things happen. And then from those things, as you said, God continually redeems things out of it, right?
Yeah.
And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. And for those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And those he predestined, there it is again, he also called. Those he called, he also justified. Those he justified, he also glorified. That really piqued my interest last night when we were doing it, because because of the word predestined. And I know that that's a hotbed for anybody who likes to dive into the predestination conversation. And to just unpack that initially, would you like to, because I'll butcher it, could you please give us a little bit of a pack down of the rough idea of predestination before you unpack it according to this verse?
The rough idea of it is that God has which means before, destined or created a destination for you or for others. So before you were ever born, he had chosen you. And if you go far enough with that, he chose some to be believers, and he chose some to be damned. The believers are for his glory, and the damned are for his glory, just to show his righteousness. And so that's what we would call a Reformed or a Calvinist double predestination. Then you can back up from that different layers, but it's the basic idea: you're chosen and you don't have a whole lot of say in it.
Okay, so once again, that totally defeats our free will, which is so important in this relationship, right? Number one. So what is the meaning of that word in this verse then?
Well, I think that verse gives its own clue to at least to how I understand predestination. And this is another hours and hours. People have been talking about predestination and free will since the earth was young. But those God foreknew, and by that I mean, that I understand, God knew from the beginning of time what you would choose. And those he foreknew, he predestined. So based on the choice that John Hilliard makes, God predestines. So God extends the invitation. God, who is outside of time, sees that John responds positively to that. And then from the beginning of time, based on his foreknowledge, he predestines you to be conformed into the image of Jesus Christ. So his predestination is based on his foreknowledge, and his foreknowledge is based on your free will. Now, if you go across the tracks to the other side of the church, they consider that utter blasphemy, because God's predestination literally hangs on your decision. And of course, they don't like that. See, basically all that's going on in the two camps is your Calvinist Reformed camp are always upholding God's sovereignty. It's their big thing. They really want to protect and preserve his sovereignty. Those on this side would say God sovereignly gave us free will. It's a demonstration of sovereignty that he allows us to choose. And God himself honors our free will because it's his gift to us. It's part of the image of God. It's not a slight.
No, and an inherent construct of a healthy relationship.
Oh, absolutely, free will. And again, this comes down to love. There is no such thing as forced love. You cannot force your wife to love you, or it's not love.
So
it has to be freely given.
So I know that I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but I do need to do enough just to satisfy my own curiosity. But with regards to, he is outside of time. He's seen that I gravitate towards his spirit. And then he basically starts to formulate a plan for my life.
Yeah, the idea is that based on what you choose in response to his offering, he predestines you. And those he predestines, he calls. Those he calls, he justifies and glorifies.
So
So, yes.
could predestination work like, okay, I accept the Lord Jesus as my, as my savior. In that moment, then God is like, okay, he made this decision. This is how these events are going to unfold in his life. We're going to start to line up some stuff so he can be as effective and partner with me in my walk.
Yeah, that's how I understand it.
Okay.
It's for the theologians watching, I understand it simplified.
Listen, it's got to be for me, and it's got to be for everybody else who's watching, because the theologians they've got their share of it. Okay, now it's time for the lay people to get it.
What happens, see, is when you're trained, as you're talking, you're thinking of the objections to what you're saying as you're going.
Right.
And so I'm aware of the objections, for the record.
I do
So
that in sales. I do that in sales.
Don't bother harassing John.
No, that's right. Okay, so all right. Well, listen, I think that are we missing anything on the why does God allow all this stuff, free will? Have we missed anything on this?
So let me circle back around for people who are maybe skipping along. You've got the one side that says God actively brings this about to punish people.
Right.
You've got the middle side who says God allows it because he's honoring free will choices and consequences, but he always works to redeem. And then you've got somebody like Tom Oord in a book called God Can't, basically says love by its nature is so uncontrolling, God couldn't stop this stuff if he wanted to. That's your three possibilities. And it'd be interesting for your listeners to start to weigh that out.
That is well, even that little tidbit of information from that book, and then the idea of using the Lord's name in vain as in your life as opposed to language. Both those two ideas to me even have got me spinning now. Like, that's incredible.
Man, if I can spin you right round, that's my job is done.
You spin me right round, baby.
Right round, baby.
Okay, let's get into the creation talk.
Okay.
And this one's going to be all you, with me being a conscientious objector, because truth be told, the creation conversation for me has never really been one of great interest personally. I do believe in intelligent design. Like, that's sort of the what I've adopted as my own belief system. But we'll interject that into your, but fill us with the schools of thought, as like, we all know that there's Christians out there who don't believe that dinosaurs can exist. There's no such thing as evolution, blah blah blah. Give us a Cole's Notes walk of what we're dealing with here in this debate.
I think creation is one of the most important doctrines right now that's underdeveloped, or at least it's not discussed often enough. And let me just give you two reasons. Number one, the foundation of all human sexuality comes out of it.
Oh,
it's in terms, you think about your last podcast.
Yeah,
creation is the foundation of that. And then two, the church takes an enormous hit. So if it takes a huge hit, as I talked earlier, in terms of why does God allow all this evil, and where is God? The other big place it takes a hit is that Christians appear so anti-scientific and anti-intellectual by hanging on to parts of the creation story that pit them against the world scientific community. It's a big deal. It's a big enough deal that I got up in youth camp one time and I said, hey, listen, and I was a throwaway line. You know what I mean by that? You might have been there because it's years ago.
Okay.
I said, I want you to know that I don't believe the earth is 6,000 years old, and I haven't believed it in a long time. And a student came up to me afterwards, and this has happened more than once, and they said, you have just saved my salvation, because I was walking away from the church because I couldn't reconcile their disregard for science.
So there are people who genuinely believe right now that the earth is 6,000 years old.
Oh man, Google it. They're dedicated to proving a young earth theory.
And you
can I unpack that?
Let's do it, man, because this is going to be probably my favorite part.
So basically, in the 1300s, you had a Catholic bishop, Bishop Ussher, not the singer, the other guy,
Not the
And he
peace up A-Town, not that guy.
no, not that guy. No,
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 not that guy.
no.
Okay.
700 years ago, give or take. And so he went back and counted all the generations in the Bible, all the begats, or the fathers of, and he assigned a certain number to each generation. And he went on back and through a little more means, here's the Cole's notes, he determined that the earth was created 4004 BC, October 22nd at 6 p.m. And from counting the begats.
And is that the only evidence?
From then, and the fact that modern English Bible started dating Genesis at 4004 BC. So you would see it in the Schofield Bible. That was a prophetic type Bible that Pentecostals used, for example, that Christians grew up believing the earth was 6,000 years old.
Well, that's another huge problem.
It comes from the 13th century.
Well, people go, well, yeah, so in the 13th century, they decided that the earth was 6,000 years old.
But not only that, the Bible doesn't exactly say when the earth was created. We know there are gaps in the genealogies. So if you were really important and your great-grandfather was really important, they would list your name and his name, and they would trust the reader because every Jew could trace his ancestry right on back. Okay. So they would just skip fathers and grandfathers if they weren't that notable and just trust you to know that that's what was going on. List your great-grandfather and his great-grandfather. And some of that went on. And but from that now, we have whole teams and societies and websites and ministries dedicated to young earth.
Oh my God. Okay, so first of all, number one, here's my initial objection to that argument. And this is going to be one of those podcasts where I'm not providing the middle. This is a topic where I'm not providing the middle ground. This is going to be me shooting holes in that belief system. It's just going to be the way it is because if somebody wants to come on and argue with the other side of it, I'm more than happy to have it. So number one, who was it that did it? Who was it that came up with this?
Bishop Ussher.
Okay, so he was a bishop, not a mathematician?
I couldn't answer that for sure.
Okay.
But all he had to do was count generations times 40 years or whatever he gave them. I'm not quite sure how he got to 6 p.m. on October 22nd.
No, okay. So number one, that's my first issue. He wasn't a mathematician. Number two, my second issue with that is basically that's a full-blown harebrained scheme, right? Like, I'm going to make a name for myself. I'm going to count all these. First, and also, we know that people in the Bible live to 700 years old. It says it specifically. So what do you give, 40 years per generation?
I can't remember exactly if it's 35 or 40 or something like that. I mean, you had Methuselah at 969.
But once again, this is total proof that people do not dive in and investigate what they so adamantly defend.
But the bigger issue is that they treat Genesis like a scientific textbook, and it's not. It's Hebrew poetry designed to bring a point. And, and the point of it is that God created everything there is.
Right.
That's what it tells us. That God is the author, the origin of life.
So 6,000 years, and it literally just came from a guy. And so here's the other part. Like, number one, the amount of arrogance you would have to have for somebody who studies God for their entire lives and then decides to impose upon followers of Christ that this is the timeline because I said so. That's number one. That's a huge red flag.
I think you're hating too much on Ussher. I think he was just sitting back trying to figure it all out, and he pitched it in the 13th century. There wasn't a whole lot else going on at the time.
No, I suppose he might have been like barred up in his house, like doing podcasts like us because he had nowhere else to go.
You know what? It could have been during the Black Plague. It's about the same timeline.
Was it?
That's interesting. I don't know. It's in 13th century, Black Plague.
So we got a 6,000-year-old Earth because of cabin fever, is what you're trying to tell me. Okay.
From that, you have generations of kids who were taught there's no such thing as dinosaurs and that every bit of radiocarbon dating is wrong and the scientific dates about the Earth being however old they say it is now, 50 million years old. All of that is wrong. All of science is wrong. All the fossils are wrong. Because we're going to stick with Bishop Ussher. And you see what kind of issue that is?
What'd you say?
You see what kind of issue that is? I mean, that's a massive issue.
It's for lack of a better term, it's ignorance on a global scale.
Asinine is the word comes to mind. It's a really useful word.
And you were talking about me hating on Bishop.
Asinine. It's an asinine. Well, the whole defending it now to me makes no sense.
Well, but it comes
Because
back
it
to
pitches for kids in school. It pitches God against science, man, and that's a terrible thing to do because all science is God's science.
well, the other thing is too that you've got to factor into that, which I've had the conversation with a lot of the guys in the charter and stuff like that before, and any time that I have any sort of conversation like this, is number one, it hurts to reevaluate. It physically is painful to reevaluate anything that you've built your belief system on.
Yeah.
There's a theory called spiral dynamics, which I find really interesting that I've come across before, where the idea is that if you are operating as an intelligent human being in modern society and someone basically destroys part of your belief system with a better argument, a lot of times what happens is you sort of devolve into a less progressive state of being. And we see this most classically with high school bullies, right? The smart ass comedian makes a joke. The bully has nothing to contend with it because he can't compete intellectually, and he devolves to a physical challenge where now he rules the roost in a physical capacity. And so people get so defensive and offended when something that they were innately taught, right, through their because now not only are you shooting holes in 6,000-year-old earth, you're shooting holes in their home church, their family, the pastor who dedicated them. This is where the pain comes from, but people misattribute it.
Yeah, because theology is not intellectual enterprise for them, it's identity.
Yes.
So I've gone after their identity when I point out and say, the Bible doesn't actually teach that. I say, go back and read your Genesis. The Bible doesn't say how old the earth is. And they look at you, because I've done this any number of times, and they look at you and they go, oh. I say, so literally go back and read it for yourself. So, and then I tell them, if you want to believe it's young, by all means, but know that the Bible doesn't teach it. And two, I would say that if there was a verse in the Bible that said the Lord created the earth on this date and therefore makes it young, I would defend that.
Right.
I would defend the Bible, and I would say, well, science probably hasn't caught up to the truth of the scriptures. But that's not what we're doing here. We're taking a 700-year-old tradition and pitching it against all of modern science and dating. And it's destroying the faith of young people who are now better educated and scientifically minded, because now they got to choose, do I believe in God or science? And they're going with science, and it's a terrible travesty to my mind.
And is that still a common thing, or is it just people like you out there in the trenches just educating them one at a time, or roomfuls of students to say, listen, you can embrace modern science and love God, or and chase a relationship with the creator of the universe, or believe in God? Like, because this is, like you said, this is not widely taught. It's not.
No, and you'll also notice in popular media, you can find it in memes. If you really want to attack a public figure, get them to admit that they believe the earth is young. It's happened in Canada. I've seen it with political figures. It's happened in the US, because right away you pitch them as against believing in any kind of fossils, dinosaurs, the whole shooting match. So now, I believe in intelligent design like you do, but I don't have to hang it on a young earth.
No, so intelligent design, for anybody who hasn't embraced, hasn't kind of come into that conversation. Intelligent design is the idea that when God created the earth, he created life so that natural selection would occur, and so that these lines, like birds and what, like, you take the Galapagos finches is the most common, right? The Darwin, and that's a very common atheist or agnostic argument, is the evolution. And you always see the Christian fish with the Darwin in the middle, which is hilarious to me, because Darwin had nothing to do with fish in his study, right? But this idea of intelligent design, where we see it, right? We see it in humanity, where humans are
Absolutely.
created the most handsome, the most athletic. They breed with the most beautiful and elegant females a lot of the times, right? And we see that. So that was, once I heard the term intelligent design, I didn't even have to dig into it a whole lot more. It was like, this is what makes sense to me.
Yeah, see, in terms of evolution, you can believe in microevolution without believing in macroevolution. And what I mean by those terms is macroevolution is the idea that from an amoeba crawled out something out of the sea and it became all of these things. I don't believe in that. But obviously, evolution is occurring within species that God created, because apparently He created two, a man and a woman. And just look around the earth now. We're not all alike. There's been an awful lot of change in the human race. And so the same with animals. They adapt, they survive, and He built that in. See, you can believe that they're adapting without having to believe it's just, it's just a secular force. God designed all of this to adapt and thrive and to change in environments. And to me, it's cool. It's proof of intelligent design.
But not only, like, even right now in this situation, we as humans have adapted to our new reality, right?
Yeah.
We
We're
wash
very
our
adaptable.
we wash our hands more. We wear face masks when we go out in public. We don't congregate within 6 feet of each other, or at least we try not to. You know what I mean? Like,
And so you don't have to see that as Darwinian. Like, so if you live in the Himalaya mountains, your lungs is going to be 30% bigger than ours who live at sea level, because you need more oxygen. It's harder to get oxygen up there. The air is thinner. Now, you can look at that one of two ways. You can be Darwinian and say, oh, look at how the species has adapted and whatever. Or you can say, how cool is God that He built within the human body the ability to adapt to its various scenarios and to thrive no matter where they find themselves. I mean, it's just as easy to go to intelligent design.
so have you struggled with or wrestled with or reconciled the idea of, like, for lack of a better term, the Homo erectus, Homo sapien, caveman conversation that gets thrown up every now and again?
To some extent, I believe that God created the original human species in whatever form they were. And I don't think we really know. I think the point of Genesis is to tell us that God is the author of life. And
Right.
that has changed tremendously since the earth was created. But it's not an accident. See, and this is another reason why the creation doctrine is so important. Just telling people this is not an accident. You are not an accident. You have a purpose. You are created with a purpose. This world is created with a purpose. The creation of the animal kingdom has a purpose, a divine purpose. That alone, see, gives you hope. Because
So
other than that, everything is just an accident. If we're just all here because of a big bang and the conditions got right in the primordial sea and something crawled out, what's the point of all this? It leads to hedonism. Get what you can, whatever pleasure,
yeah,
materialism, all the bad isms, because there is no point to life. It's hopeless.
right. Get what you can on the way out.
Get what you can. Who dies with the most toys wins.
Enjoy the ride.
Yeah.
And the funny part is that there's a part of my life that I've lived in that capacity, because, like, part of me is a bit of an anarchist. I'm just like, if it's a free for all, right? Let it rip and let the chips fall where they may. I do my life professionally in that capacity, but I don't do my marriage in that capacity, because I value my wife too highly to lose her, right? And so,
But your faith tells you were created you have a purpose, a greater purpose than just accumulating.
I'll tell you what the interesting part about that, and we joked about that before, about me sort of convincing myself that God wasn't real and then re-believing on a 5-hour flight to California. But it was important for me in that moment to decide if I would still believe in some higher power if I did not have the Bible. And for me, the reality is that that's a fundamental belief. Do you believe that this is it here right now? This is the end of it? Or do you believe that there is something greater? That's a fundamental struggle for everybody, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you
That's
need to
the
wrestle with it.
that's the initial light switch, right? When you walk in the room, do you flip that switch one way, or do you leave, or the other way? Are you comfortable
Right.
in the room you're in, or do you want to, depending on the way you look at it, do you want to shed some light on it, or, whatever? Um,
Right.
so what do we say? Because I can guarantee you, if anybody makes it this deep into the podcast, there's going to be a lot of really twisted up heads over
If you're still here, God love you.
Right, over the creation. So how do we do our due diligence with regards to because, man, I had this argument not but 2 years ago with somebody about taking Genesis literally, and his argument was that the Bible was inherent and that it was infallible, and then my argument was, well, which Bible is infallible? Because they're not all the same, number one, right? And then number two, what do we say to people who are what scientific evidence exists in Genesis, if any at all? What is being used as scientific evidence or as,
Well, see, what happens is people say everybody claims to take the Bible literally, but they pretty well all know they don't take the Bible literally. Because there are things in the Bible not meant to be taken literally, because there's a pile of symbolism in the Bible.
My initial conversation was Proverbs.
Yeah. See, Proverbs this gets really touchy for people. You talk about going back to their identity. Proverbs are not promises. Because people quote, train up a child in the way they should go, and when he's old, he will not depart from it, as if this is a steadfast, absolute promise. But Proverbs are not promises, they're sayings. And so you get, for example, better to live on the corner of a rooftop than in the house with a quarrelsome wife.
Right. You're not actually supposed to literally go on your roof and sit on the corner.
No, here's another one.
You
Mere
talk. You can sit in the middle. You got the free will to do so.
Yeah. Mere talk leads to poverty. Well, that's generally true, but then you get people like Oprah who made their living talking.
Or politicians.
So yeah, Proverbs is a good example of that. And see, Genesis is this certain kind of Semitic Hebraic writing, almost poetry, that's designed to show us that God systematically and intentionally created the world and everything in it. It's not meant to be scientific. And what happens now in the 20th century, 21st century, is we are overlaying our understanding of what it means to read the Bible literally and scientifically, and we're putting that on top of the Bible.
Gotcha.
And when you do that, the answers you get are almost guaranteed to be yours because you put the framework on top of it instead of just letting the Bible speak for itself.
Right.
And again, this is another conversation maybe when we go back and talk about the use of the Old Testament. But the very concepts of authority, infallibility, inerrancy, what does it mean to say the Bible is totally without error? I mean, there's all kinds of ink being spilled on those concepts. And again, they are concepts that the Christian and the church really needs to think through carefully. And if you challenge them at all, then people think you don't take the Bible seriously.
Yeah, they think that you're not a real Christian, or you're a heretic, or you're whatever, right? Blasphemous.
But I would argue that until you think through those concepts, you don't take the Bible seriously.
Flip side.
Mm-hmm.
Well, listen, I think that's a great starting point, honestly. Do you got anything else for us before we clue up?
No, I think we should let Genesis come to us and teach us what it's designed to teach, which is everything has come from God. Questions about the age of the earth, even questions about whether or not God did this in 6 24-hour days. Some people believe it.
That was going to be my last question. So let's dig into that for a second, because is that the basis of this argument for most people, is that God created the earth in 7 days? But like, then it also says in the Bible that a day is like 1,000 years.
Yeah, and not only that, the Hebrew word there for day is just like the English word for day. So I can use day, meaning, tomorrow, as a day, but I can also say, John, back in our day at youth camp, you were a nuisance.
Yeah, and you were right, number one. And then also it was...
And I don't mean a particular 24-hour day. I mean, you were a nuisance a lot of times.
Yeah, 100%.
Back in a period of time, back in our day. Right? And the Hebrew word for day is the same thing. It can mean both. And so that's one point. The second point is that, you know, it's the Earth revolving on its axis relative to the sun, and that brings morning and evening, and the sun doesn't show up till the fourth day.
Right. Well, this is a whole nother idea. And listen, I don't care if we cut this out or not, because the idea is that, like, you want to wrap somebody's head upside down, look at them and say, well, time's only a construct as it exists on Earth, right? Because
That's an excellent question. Does
our
time
time,
exist in eternity?
right? And how does, like, you got to be we need Neil deGrasse Tyson on here to have that conversation. If time can exist in eternity. Somebody will call me a heretic now just for bringing up that name, probably. But yeah, so that's an interesting, because if it's a day, then the days don't even show up till the fourth day.
Exactly. But again, I tell people, if you want to believe it's 6 24-hour days, fill your boots.
Yeah.
Know that it's possible that it's 6 periods of time where God first does this, then God first does that, then God first does something else, and that would be perfectly acceptable in the text as well.
So because I promised somebody that we would touch on the dinosaur piece, and it's funny because I had a conversation with Cal Andrews one day, and Cal Andrews told me that when he went to Bible college and he realized he could still believe in dinosaurs, he got saved all over again.
Exactly.
Right. And so does that argument that argument comes out of the fact that dinosaurs are supposed to be older than 6,000 years old, and we don't believe that the Bible is older than 6,000 years? Is that what it is?
That's the bottom line. And so right off the bat, if you do away with Ussher's, genealogies, you can say, yeah, if science says the Earth is 60 million years old, I'm cool with that. So now problem solved.
Huh. And everybody's all of a sudden magically on the same page, and Christians don't look like crackpots anymore.
Yeah, by just saying the Bible doesn't clearly teach it, so I'm not hanging my hat on it. That's where I am personally.
Yeah, and there's no, like, okay, it tells you all the generations, but there's
it's not meant to be read as we read modern historical or scientific textbooks. That's not what the scriptures were ever intended for. It doesn't mean they lie. It means they have a different purpose.
Well, and I had this conversation. I had this conversation with, talking about absolute truths, and what can you really pin it as an absolute truth, when an absolute truth is a product of perspective. So if what I see is blue and what you see is blue, because the chemistry in our eyeballs are different, we see blue differently. That's a scientific fact. And so seeing things from a different perspective, that's what I'm trying to do here too, is just to show the middle ground and both sides of the argument. You know what I mean? So that people can kind of decide for themselves. But the idea of this sort of absolute truth, which I know is going to lose some people, but the reality is that today is Wednesday. That's an absolute truth, unless somebody watches this on Thursday, in which case that's not true anymore.
Yep.
That's the most simple way I can make it. You know what I mean? So there
are some things in the Christian worldview that are true, whether you acknowledge them or believe them or not.
Yeah, that's a good point.
They just are. Now, the whole move towards relativism in our culture, which is another conversation, is the shift from modernity to postmodernity, means that absolute truth has now fallen in favor, so that things can be true for you and they're not true for me. And they extend that to everything.
Right.
But some things are still true, like gravity.
Yes, that's a good point. Yep. You can't argue with gravity, can you?
And I would argue also some things are true, like sin and redemption.
Right. Okay. Absolute truths for all time.
Yep. Whether you accept them or not.
Whether you accept them or not. Well, I think there's no better ending place than that for me.
Well, man, it was fun again.
Yeah, buddy. I appreciate it. I'm sure we'll do it again whenever I can hoax you and convince you and twist your rubber arm to get on here again. But I really do value your time. I know anybody who watches these things do value your time. I had a lot, not to fluff your curly headed ego, but I had a lot of conversations after the fact, and a lot of people really valued it. And I think that I would like to at least pass on my gratitude from them to you for doing this.
I do this because I believe it's my calling, and if there's such a thing as a teacher in the church, then I believe that's what I'm called to, and I'm more convinced than ever that this is the particular medium the Spirit is going to use in the next century.
And all we're trying to do is be obedient.
That's it. Go where He leads you, man. Don't go through the doors as they open.
Amen. Thank you again, and I appreciate it.
Hey, once again, thanks for checking out the conversation between me and Dr. Bradley Truman Noel about the creation aspect, evolution, dinosaurs. And if you made it all the way, I hope you didn't miss the section about the idea and the philosophy that God can't intervene. That's a whole interesting discussion in its own right. So, once again, as always, if you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe, share it with your friends, let them know. And once again, thanks for watching. God bless.